with the additional borrowing that always occurs in times of war. All national debts can only, and have only grown ever larger at the time of writing this. For example, England national debt is now approaching the £300 billion mark. One of the inevitable results has been that taxation of the general population in virtually every kafir state in the world has also continued to grow steadily through the years, which is why nowadays many people who do vote tend to vote for whoever promises to tax them the least. This, in Faker, is the economic basis of modern democracy, a Shrer whose government is elected to service the national debt by taxing the general electorate. This is the realery of control debt and motivation through fear syndromes. This is basis of the New World Order. Inexorable economic control disguised by liberal political debate. Thus, to summarize, the people who really rule the kafir states of today are not the politicians who appear on television, but rather the people who control the major finance and business institutions. That is, the Freemasons. Effective control is exercised especially by using the kafir banking system to create debts by charging interest, which grow so large that they can never be repaid. In order to speed up the process of creating debts, the Freemasons, as we have already seen, create conflict situations out of which profits are made by selling the goods, especially armaments and food needed by the sides who have been drawn into conflict at a high price, and out of which debts are created by providing those goods on credit at interest. The conflict situations created by the Freemasons vary from manipulating market forces, especially in the commodity markets, and on the stock and money exchanges, to engineering war on a large scale. Thus, for example, in order to curb the wealth of the Muslim oil-producing countries during the boom of the 1970s, and especially after the price of oil was quadrupled by OPEC in 1973 in response to the high-tech North's support of Israeli military aggression against the Arabs. In the Yom Kippur War, the cost of crude oil from the Middle East was soon reduced, not only by renegotiating the price per barrel, but also by devaluing the currencies of all the oil-producing countries, by revaluing the exchange rates within the international banking system, as well as by manipulating supply and demand, and therefore value on the international money markets. During the 1980s, Iraq was armed, at its own expense, in order to wage war on and weaken Iran. Once this had been achieved, increasing both Iraq's and Iran's dependence on the international banking system in the process, Iraq was then encouraged to invade Kuwait, while at the same time Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states were warned that if American troops, accompanied by token forces from other countries to create the impression of its being an international affair, were not permitted to come to their rescue at their expense, then they would be the next to be invaded by Iraq. The troops came, the Gulf War ensued, all the latest technological weapons, including the chemical ones, and their vaccines were tested. Kuwait was destroyed and had to be rebuilt at its own expense. Much of Iraq was destroyed and its population decimated, and Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf states spent billions on financing the war and buying obsolete armaments in order to ensure that the same thing did not happen all over again. During the early 1990s, therefore, vast profits were made by the armaments industry, and vast profits were made by the international banking system as funds poured out of the Middle East into the high-tech North at one rate of exchange, and then eventually back again, once it was all over, at another rate of exchange. As a result, the oil wealth of the Middle East had been reduced to virtually nothing, and as if to emphasize the hold which the international banking system now enjoys over Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the Beachy Arab Bank was closed down almost overnight, wiping out much of the Muslims' wealth throughout the world in the process. Once again, everything had gone more or less according to plan, and the architects of the New World Order had triumphed. This was the same kind of carefully orchestrated activity of which both Ezra Pound and Adolf Hitler were fully aware and tried to prevent, but without any success. Perhaps one of the main reasons why Pound and Hyder failed to expose and destroy the activities of the Freemasons was because they were not fully aware of the true nature of existence. The true nature of existence is that nothing exists, only Allah. It follows that anything other than Allah only appears to exist if you give it reality. The way of Muhammad, may the blessings and peace of Allah be on him, means that reality is given to Allah. The way of Kufr means that reality is given to other than Allah. If enough of the people who are at present enslaved by the Kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, and who are accordingly imprisoned by the Kafir view of existence, decide to follow the way of Muhammad, and accordingly cease to give reality to what they have been conditioned to give reality to by the educational and media systems, then the producer-consumer process will collapse and cease to exist, especially once the Muslims abandon the banks and their worthless paper and plastic money. Thus, the way to fight the Kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, is not to fight it, but to leave it, ignore it. The way to leave the system is to follow the way of Muhammad. May Allah bless him and grant him peace. The system is already in an advanced state of collapse. Accordingly, it is becoming easier and easier to leave it and to follow the way of Muhammad, and when the system does collapse, it will be the Muslims who will best be able to cope with what happens next. The choice is yours, right now. One of the main reasons why the Kafir system, that is, the Dajjal system, is in an advanced stage of self-destruction and collapse is that the money, which is the lifeblood of the consumer-producer process, and which is the medium by which control through debt is exercised through the banking system, is only really worth the paper on which it is printed. As the lifeblood of the producer-consumer system, it is totally anemic. Money only succeeds in its role as the medium by which control through debt is exercised through the banking system, because enough people think it is worth something. Money, however, only has the value which people ascribe to it, but it has no inherent value of its own. Money is only numbers printed on bits of paper or stored in mega computer databases. Anyone who uses this kind of money is part of a gigantic confidence trick. Once the trick is exposed, it is impossible to place any confidence in either paper or plastic or microchip money. The endless discussions on the illusory topic of inflation and the futile attempts to resolve the illusory problem of inflation are only either decoys, smoke screens, or red herrings to disguise the fact that the real issue is not the question of money losing value, simply because it has no real value to lose in the first place. The reason why money has absolutely no value today, other than the illusory value which the great majority of people are conditioned to give it, is on account of the way in which it has been and is handled by the international banking system and the international money markets. In order to appreciate this fact, it is necessary to look at what money used to be before the present banking system was first introduced. Money used to be made principally of gold or silver. Since it was made from these precious metals, it had inherent value. Even if it was melted down, its value did not change, unlike paper money. Whicat foreign bait 451 ignites and turns to ashes. Coins minted in different countries of the world could nevertheless be used as a means of exchange in any other country in the world. Once the quality and purity of the gold or silver used to mint the coin was established, simply by weighing it, as a result, the value of money remained more or less constant, while the prices of the goods for which it was exchanged fluctuated, as the market forces of supply and demand varied. Furthermore, up until the time of the Reformation of the European Trinitarian Church, which occurred during the 16th century, usurious transactions were forbidden for and avoided by all believing Jews, Christians, and Muslims. During the Reformation, however, The Jews argued that they were entitled to charge non-Jews interest. The Christians argued that instead of no interest, they would permit low interest. And at a much later stage, some of the Muslims argued that if interest was given a different name, like service charge, then it was no longer interest. As soon as interest began to be charged, the value of money was affected, since it had now become a commodity in itself, not merely a means of exchange. And accordingly, value was now marginally subject to the market forces of supply and demand. The first banks were formed to look after other people's money by keeping it in a safe place. Although, of course, even at this stage money still had a palpable and valuable form. The practice arose whereby when someone deposited gold or silver in the bank, the banker would give the depositor a written receipt, whereby he promised to repay the bearer on demand the gold or silver when that receipt was presented to him. The practice then arose that these receipts became transferable. Thus, the depositor of the gold was able to buy goods to the value of the gold in the bank by giving his receipt to the seller of the goods. The seller of the goods could then take that receipt to re-bank and collect the gold, even though it was not he who had originally deposited the gold there. Since gold and silver are relatively heavy, and since paper is relatively light, the bankers then hit upon the idea of printing paper money. Anyone who deposited gold and silver with them was given this paper money. That paper money could then be used in any number of consecutive transactions. The understanding being that anyone at any time who had these notes come into his or her possession could, if he or she wanted, take them to the bank and exchange them for the gold or silver which they represented. At this relatively simple stage, during the mid-19th century, every paper note was backed by its equivalent amount of gold or silver. You could exchange one for the other at any time. It was also at this stage, if not before, the bankers discovered that for every 13 pounds of gold or silver deposited with them, only one of these 13 pounds was actually physically required by the customer to spend at any one time, which left the bankers free to loan on interest, or otherwise profitably invest, the other 12 pounds. This meant, in effect, that for every 13 paper pound notes, only one needed to be backed by gold, and this is what happened. It was no longer the case that every paper note referred back to its equivalent in gold or silver. Instead, for every pound's worth of gold or silver, which the banks had in their vault, 13 paper pound notes were printed. At this stage, however, you could still go into the bank, produce a paper pound, ask for a pound's worth of gold, and get it, provided that not everyone tried to exchange their paper money for gold or silver at the same time. The banks were careful, even though, in fact, not all the paper money was backed by gold anymore. At this stage, in real terms, paper money was only really worth 1/13 of what it used to be worth. Gradually, people became so used to using paper money that no one even thought of going to the bank and asking for gold or silver in exchange. Everyone believed that the paper money was worth what it said it was worth on its two sides, rather as its face value. At the same time, the volume of the bank's business was increasing. As the origins of what is today's consumer-producer process began to get underway and become established, this meant that the banking system was creating more and more money, not by printing more banknotes, but by charging interest. Debts owed to the banks, especially vast national debts, grew on paper in the ledgers as the interest ticked up. But the money created in this way had no direct connection with the money which was already in existence, and which was backed by gold in the proportion of 13 paper to 1 gold or silver. In effect, money was being created out of nothing, and this out-of-nothing money was not even being manifested in the form of pound notes, but was merely being given a tenuous reality by being recorded in a ledger, or, as today, in a computer. This put the banks in a more precarious position. If, for example, everyone decided to draw their paper money out of the bank at the same time, the bank simply would not be able to produce it, simply because the volume of money, which was recorded as existing in the ledgers or in the computers, was so much greater than the number of printed money notes in actual circulation. Thus, at this stage, there were two credibility tricks which the banks had to play on the growing number of customers who were needed by the banks for both profit and manipulation purposes. The first trick was to fool everyone into thinking that all the paper money was still backed by gold, even though people no longer tried to change paper notes for their gold equivalent. The second trick was to fool everyone into thinking that all the money, which existed according to the computer and ledger records, actually existed in the form of paper notes. Neither of these illusions created by the Freemasonic magician bankers was real, but as long as the great majority of the population thought they were real, then the whole magical but totally illusory system continued to work, and indeed continues to work today. As a result of the massive debts created during the First World War, according to official estimates, there was a 475% increase in the world's national debts. As a whole, between 1914 and 1920, the vast gulf that now existed between the volume of money that had been created through interest and the volume of paper money that had actually been printed was so great that it was no longer feasible to maintain the 13 paper to 1 gold ratio. During the next decade, therefore, the international banking system abandoned the gold standard altogether, and from this point onwards, it was no longer possible to take a paper note into a bank and demand its equivalent in gold or silver. From this point onwards, the value of paper currencies could be altered by the international banking system and the international money markets almost at will. From this point onwards, the value of money was increasingly determined by supply and demand on the international money markets, and by government policy as regards exports, imports, and the balance of payments.